Nishino's feet slapped against the floor, his clawed middle toe making a clink each time his feet struck. If one were to be so inclined, so regular was his footfalls, and so loud was the staccato tapping of the claw, one could make a rather catchy beat with it. He held a data sliver in his shoulder claw, a bygone evolutionary relic of his species, from when his people used to grip the trees of their native home in order to shed their outer carapace. His outer shell was a deep brown, which meant he would molt soon. His lead broodmare longed for the day that would happen. She had gotten rather tired of his current appearance, and frankly, so had he. He had been happy to learn that his new carapace was going to be a vibrant, bright green. His carapace was the last thing on his mind, though. He clicked his wings, another evolutionary relic, and walked into the lift that would take him down to the bridge level. He fidgeted with the data sliver in his shoulder claw. Some of his people had no movement in the appendage, but he wasn't one of them. He had a habit of taking small tools and twirling them with the dexterity he still had, which he had been told by his work leader was interesting to see. As the lift doors opened to the bridge, Nishino's clicking claw sounded loud on the deck, intermingled with other clicks from other claws. A Urela transport was treated, for all intents and purposes, just like any military craft in the Uralan Defense Force. Protocol on the bridge was expected to be formal, and as such, Nishino raised the softer bulge of his footpad off of the ground, leaving only his clawed forelimb touching the floor. He took the data sliver from his shoulder claw and held his six-fingered hands out wide, showing he had no weapons. This, of course, was yet another evolutionary relic from the times when males would engage in combat over broodmares and tucked their forelimbs to hide a chitinous bladed forearm. He came to the command pit and spread his winged shell, bowing his head and offering forward the data sliver in both hands. "I hold the word of the elite." Nishino stood in the pose, preparing himself to stay in this position for a while. Depending on the needs of the captain, he might be here for a few hours. He had even seen a supplicant standing in this position for the better part of 2 days. But in all honesty, he didn't expect to be here long. Not many captains left directives from the elite unheeded for long if they wanted to stay captain. Still, he prepared himself to go into torpor, the semi-hibernating state the Urela could go to for rest. Just as he was running through the mental relaxations to allow himself a lapse into the unconscious mind, he felt the sliver taken from his outstretched hands. He immediately straightened, then flexed his wings in the common salute. The captain didn't acknowledge him further, and he didn't look at the captain at all. It was unseemly for a lower rank such as himself to stare or even really get caught looking at his leader. Nishino turned and did the high-postured walk back across the bridge towards the lift, not even pausing as he heard a grinding of mandibles, a clear sound of surprise. Even if he had known it had come from his captain, he would not have turned or even paid it another bit of his mind. It simply was not his concern. He did wonder, for a brief moment, what the sensation of surprise felt like. He had never felt it. As a young male, one day he might find himself in a position where he would be required to have an opinion, or even emotions, really. But that was not today. That was why the Urela had leaders, after all. At this point in his life cycle, Nishino was only meant to listen and obey, and because of his standing, it's all he really wanted to do anyway. He was a drone, after all. He stepped into the lift and pressed the rune for Surf Level 3. Then he contemplated the remainder of his day. There were only a few more matters for him to attend to, and he wanted to spread them out. Of course, it would be more economical to finish his tasks quickly, but that was not how things were done. He was already looking forward to achieving a full state of torpor this afternoon. His work leader had actually advised it. Nishino was living through the time his people were referring to as the Age of Ease. In the cycles of his ancestors, those with his social standing would be lucky to have any free time at all, much less what he had. Elevated social status was longed for greatly during those times, to give one a chance to attract mates, to raise young, and just to essentially pursue leisure. It wasn't a matter of ambition by any means. Hope, maybe? He could not tell. In this age of the Urela, however, even a drone such as himself could easily find that time. Sometimes he wondered what had changed, but then again he decided at the end of the day that if the reasons his people lived the way they did now were important, he'd be told one day. He arrived back at his workspace and settled his carapace. He brought up his monitor and checked over the transport logs. Then instead he decided to spend some time in torpor. He brought himself into the mental relaxation, his vision locking on the screen as his breathing slowed. The deep sense of euphoria soon came, and his limbs locked as he rested in his workspace. He entered the dream space, floating in the recesses of his own mind, enjoying the sensations of warmth and soothing waves throughout his body. Torpor was the healing state of the mind, the fully relaxed state, his brains releasing chemicals that flowed throughout his system. There was a theory that even those of his status were being made aware of, and that was that with the increased use of torpor throughout Urella society, that lifespans were skyrocketing. As a consequence, so had birth rates, and as a consequence of that, there was almost a stagnation of the social strata. His broodsire had only risen to the rank of a work leader, nothing more. To be honest, it suited him. The Urella were not driven by ambition. When there was a need, when the social hierarchy required it, one of his people with sufficient social standing would simply begin to assume the responsibilities and needs of their given task. Even in the dream state of torpor, he was fully aware of what was going on around him. He was aware that at some point his work leader had come to his workspace and clicked his wings once, a sign of approval at Nishino taking his advice. A bit later, he took note of a few of his work fellows walking past the entrance to his workspace. Suddenly, he was pulled completely out of his torpor state as he breathed in something unusual. His people did not have a particularly good sense of smell, not compared to other species that Nishino knew of, nor did they have a great sense of hearing. He heard stories that a species called the Baraki could hear a whispered conversation from down a busy hallway, which was absolutely absurd to Nishino. Where the Urella did not possess the smell or hearing that others did, they had a very keen sensitivity to sensation. What was hitting his lungs now was unmistakable. There was a fire somewhere. He came back to awareness and reached for his console and tapped 2 runes, one symbolizing an emergency and the other symbol for fire. Now that his duty was done, he settled back. He didn't think to check on the source of the emergency. Again, it was not his function. His function was to monitor his station and take data slivers to his superiors when communications came in from the wider territories. Nothing more and nothing less. Even if the thought occurred to him to seek out the emergency, he wouldn't know what to do about it. The concept of fighting a fire himself was as alien as deciding to pilot a fighter or fire a rifle. Of course, if it got too close, he understood that he would need to leave. For a moment, he considered a rare possibility. What if he was turned to fight the fire? Would it be like his current task where he simply was told what he needed to do and understood? Would it mean a change in his social strata? A change in him. He knew that need drove the society, subconscious need. Those from higher social stratas could determine the need and elevate other Urella into those positions. His captain could, should he find the need, elevate Nishino himself into a new position, and just like with his position now, Nishino would find that he could understand that which only hours before had been a complete mystery before. He could understand what was needed, what was requested. He could understand what they needed him to do. Nishino felt the sensation in his lungs grow a bit thicker as he thought what it might be like to be elevated to a higher position. Sentience was driven by social strata and the need of the group. Might he gain emotion, reason? What was that even like? In his torpor state, he actually noticed one of the very Urella he was thinking of moving past his entrance. On the way to deal with the fire, he assumed. Suddenly, he corrected himself mentally. A warrior clade. Nishino found it odd. Warrior clades did not come up to crew decks, and he wasn't even aware that the transport required them. He wondered why the warrior was even there as he continued to sit at his console. His work/leisure rotation was going to be up shortly, so he decided to get his rotation report filed. He quickly filled out the report detailing the messages that had come in and those he had responded to. As he placed the sliver he had taken to the bridge to the captain earlier in his report, he looked to make sure the title was correct, as he had all the others. Restraint collars to be deactivated was the title. Nishino completed the report, a stray thought lingering on the title. That was the message that had surprised the captain. Of course, Nishino knew what a restraint collar was. Even a low drone such as himself knew that perfectly well. It was for the slaves, the humans. To Nishino, there was a clear protocol in place should he ever see an uncollared human was to notify his local security as soon as was convenient. It was curious that an order such as that would come through, but once again, it was not Nishino's concern. Matters like that were for those higher in the social strata, not him. He didn't ask himself what could be happening or why the collars that all the humans wore would be deactivated. He truly did not even know what the collars did to the humans, and he did not care. What Nishino couldn't have known, what no one on the transport knew, was that the message hadn't come from the elites. What he did not know was that he was a part of an endangered species, a species that was vanishing. Long ago, the reigning elites of his species had made a deal with a species called the Vral. The Urela to the Vral were not a worthy conquest. Short-lived, their males often worked to death, their females only concerned with their brood, and locked into a social hierarchy so strict that a single untimely death of one of their leaders could set them back years. The Urela had drifted beneath the Vral's notice simply because their resources were limited, and their working population too fragile and short-lived. Urela space was a series of dead-end systems. The only result of subjugating the Urela would be their extinction, or at the very least a drastic reduction in their ability to function as a society to the point where it would be detrimental. Eventually, of course, the Vral had plans to wipe out the socially handicapped Urela, but that could have always come later. The Vral traded 200 humans to the Urela, and of course there were complications. The humans at first rebelled, almost taking down an entire city before they were brought to heel, but the elites had seen what the humans were capable of. They just needed to be stripped of a few negative traits first. The restraint collar had did just that. A small neckband that provided a constant injection of chemical compounds. It rendered the humans docile, compliant, and subservient. Once the design of the restraint collar had been produced and the results were displayed on the 22 humans that survived their own rebellion, the Urela had began to buy as many of the humans as the Vral were willing to sell. The Urela's slave trade with the Vral had fundamentally changed their society, the frail Urela being replaced in labor-intensive positions by humans, then rapidly replaced by the humans in manufacturing as well as construction. The Urela introduced mass breeding programs because they found human reproduction massively inefficient. To an outside observer, of which none truly visited, what was happening to the humans would have been horrifying. Human females were kept sedated, used as breeding stock until the practice rendered them infertile, then disposed of. Each viable human female had been subjected to rudimentary cloning, and the clones had been subjected to the same. Any human male who did not have a satisfactory genetic profile was gelded. Human offspring were kept in brood pens, raised until they could be instructed, and then fitted with the restraint collar and assigned. In total, the Urela had bought nearly 500 million humans who were stripped from United Earth ships that had been disabled, and Antares itself when it had been conquered. Now, throughout Urela territory, there were over 19 billion of them. For decades, the Urela society had been dynamically altered, the increased productivity of the humans doubling, tripling, then quadrupling the industrial output, before even the massed industrialization had taken place. The Urale had gone from a backwater to a burgeoning power in less than 80 years, so much so that the Vral had been considering taking them down. Then the Terran front had charged from the cage that the Vral had put them in, and a new Antares had started making its way across the stars, closer and closer to the Urela's borders. The Baraki, long the Urela's galactic neighbors, had alerted the Terrans of the fact the Urale kept human slaves. Not even the Baraki knew how far the Urela had gone. The Urela elites, the ruling body of the Urela, determined that once the Terran front reached their border, there would be no hiding what they had done. Panic had begun to set in, and in the midst of that panic an order was given. 1,000 restraint collars were deactivated in a test, the chemical neuroblockers wearing off in minutes. The humans, almost immediately after, rebelled. The mostly passionless Urale were completely unprepared for the absolute fury, the outrage, and the hatred they now faced from a species that they had pacified and used so brutally. The Urale, themselves not used to the way that humans could learn, had inadvertently shown their newly released slaves how to free the rest of their species. The elites were all dead. The homeworld of the insectoid species had fallen in mere hours, freed humans attacking their former overlords with a rage that far passed genocidal. Newly freed humans left their stations, attacking any Urale they could find, tearing them down with the same brutal efficiency that the Urale had prized in them. Not a single message had gotten off the homeworld. Within hours, new messages were transmitted using the code identifiers and authority of the elites, ordering all restraint collars to be deactivated. Although the orders were met with surprise in most cases, the orders were carried out. One didn't disobey orders in Urale society. The Urale, a species that had endured in its small corner of space for the last 5,000 years, its female population only specialized in childbearing, its male population working itself to death in almost 90% of cases throughout almost all of its history, ceased to be a viable species in less than 15 standard Terran hours. 16 hours after the first collars went offline, they were on the verge of extinction, and as Nishino sat at his console, smelling the fire but not moving because in his species it was not his place to address the issue, a human male came in his entrance. Nishino saw the human, noted the fact that the human did not have their restraint collar on, and turned to his console. He also noted the fact that the human was covered in ichor, and the human had in his hand a pipe-like object with a sharp point. Nishino tapped the rune for emergency, then tapped the rune for security. A moment later, Nishino felt the tip of the human spear ram into his back, piercing his dull brown carapace easily and nailing him into his console. He didn't know what to do now, and stared with dull eyes down at the metal protruding from his chest. His finger came up and reached for the security rune again, but he was yanked back by the human pulling on the spear. Nishino fell on his back, his ruined carapace splintering under his own weight, completely unsure of what to do as the human stomped on his chest. The Urale drone watched in complete befuddlement as the spear lanced through his head. 16 hours, 7 minutes, and 12 Terran seconds after the first restraint collars had been deactivated, Nishino died, leaving only 2,006 of his species alive. 2005, 2004, 2003. Fleet Marshal Simmons ignored the irritation in her scalp as the Baraki Order flagship slowly arched back into formation, with its own fleet. She leaned over the plot table with a smile on her face as the Baraki fleet itself began to change, its alignment heading towards the jump gate to the exosystem. Petty Officer Hazard wore a sheepish grin, his arms crossed, looking down at the same display as her hands spread and gripped the edge. He had been instrumental, yet again, in dealing with the yet another species. In fact, she's not quite sure how he picked up on the things that he managed to pick up on, but she could almost swear he was psychic at this point. When the Baraki had been cautious with her at first, he had let her know that they were nervous. When they had lowered their heads when she spoke of the offensives that she intended to carry out in the area, it was him that let her know that they might want to speak. When their equal of an admiral had laid out his plan, Hazard had alerted her to the challenge in the Baraki's posture, that he had expected pushback. Simmons had been trained since she was 12 to read a battlefield, had been tutored by the best strategists and historians the Terran front could get its hands on, and had been selected because of the raw talent she had displayed during her formative years. Hazard seemed like he could read the expressions of a species he had never met the same way she read a battlefield. In the end, the Baraki admiral, called a princeling in their rankings, had debated with Simmons on the best avenues for the Baraki themselves to take. The two had actually debated, negotiated, and bartered over branches in a shared advance. With Hazard in her ear, she had made the snap decision to offer elements of the Terran fleet to the Baraki if they were needed. The Baraki had walked away with their ears perked up, where they had laid flat and long down their backs. It was almost comical to Simmons how as the meeting had entered its last hour their ears had slowly arched to stand up straight. Simmons had realized, with Hazard's help, that the Baraki were hoping to be treated as equals, even though they didn't see themselves as such. It wasn't a big stretch, considering that the Antares itself outweighed more than half of their fleet by herself. But it did give her, finally, first-hand experience dealing with a species that might be worried about their future after the Vral were finished. The Baraki had come into this expecting to be dictated to, but wound up leaving with a much different footing. As the Baraki were loading into their shuttle, Simmons had flippantly said she was going to handle every other species like that, and again Hazard had spoken to her. She was a fleet marshal, but she didn't get to that position by ignoring words of wisdom, and when Hazard told her that if she had taken the same tact with the Turinica, they would have been offended, she only made a snide comment about not caring how they felt. She really didn't know if she was being honest with herself considering the news coming from that border, but some pains persisted. She hadn't dismissed Hazard back to his duties, and so he had followed her to the bridge. If she had dealt with her hair annoying her for the 2 hours of the meeting, he could deal with her being a bit lax in releasing him, even though she had no real intention of releasing him back to his normal duties. So now she stood watching the Baraki fleet moving away, Hazard hovering by her side. She expanded the map, and as she did, she glanced at Hazard, who was looking towards the armored viewport that dominated the bow-facing wall. She subconsciously reached for a small headset and slipped it on, then set her frequency to the communications internal channel. "Comms, are your ears on?" she asked, breaking into a conversation mid-sentence that had appeared to be about which railgun was better, the RLX 7500 or the Hyperion Model 3 series. The second she started speaking, the entire channel went silent for a few moments. "Comms here, Fleet Marshal," came the reply of Commander Yi. "What can I do for you?" "Come to the table," she replied. Then she took off the headset and leaned back, looking to her right and seeing the middle-aged commander standing up with an expression of concern. She looked back down to the table, even as an update came in on the lane map. Another system had just been taken from the RAL. She could expect to hear all about this on the next debrief, but she was curious now. She opened the lane map onto her primary display, focused on the system, and checked for any notations for the change. Aside from the name of the system, Lakota, the only information she had available was the IT was taken by Fleet 3, Lighthammer 7. Nothing on planets, nothing at damaged ships, nothing at all. She straightened and blew out a breath as Yi climbed up the 3 stairs to the dais with her table on it. "Commander, I need a liaison. Take this petty officer away and bring him back an ensign. All his former duties are done, and make sure he shows up with a meritorious achievement on his chest too, or he'll be out of uniform." She didn't look back to see Hazard's shocked expression, or look over to see Yi's pleased one. She heard Yi tell Hazard that he was out of uniform on the bridge and how it was a bad first impression, and grinned to herself. As Hazard was led away, she glanced at his back, then back down to the table. He was not going to be very busy at first, but that was going to change as time went on. Trust went a long way, knowing someone was giving her the best information they had. She was lucky, and she knew it, not to be born in an era where the politics of rank could be cutthroat. She didn't have tolerance for that. She turned and began making her way to her quarters, determined to let her hair out of the torture device that she had put it into. Whoever thought 2 pins could cause this much irritation? Her hand was already reaching up as she came to the first door, and as soon as the door closed, she yanked the pin out. She blew out a sigh, then pulled the other pin, fluffing her fingers through her hair. As the second door opened and she entered her quarters, she looked to the armored viewport, and for a second she wondered if she could see Saul from here. She smirked to herself, knowing that even if she could see it, she wouldn't know which one of the tiny pinpricks it was in the backdrop of everything else. She was trying to process something she didn't quite know how to quantify, a sensation that she had began having from the moment she had split the fleets. She leaned against the viewport, staring out into space, and felt the sensation return. It was almost melancholic. The Vral Empire had been the faceless enemy from the stars for so long. The fact that Thermopylae was there, the fact that they had been at war for nearly 4 generations, all of which had shifted so radically now, none of that was lost on her. She became aware of her own reflection and stared at herself for a long moment. "What are you going to do when this is over?" she asked herself, and did not even know how to begin answering that question. She turned and walked to her desk, flicking her fingers over the latest reports from a dozen recently conquered systems. News that would have made her burst into tears and happiness days ago now was met with a satisfied smile. But the reports had become commonplace. Large slave populations freed, a new species encountered having been taken from the yoke of the Varal themselves. The intense feeling of satisfaction and vindication had never waned. The knowledge what she was doing was good and right. She glanced to the picture that sat on her desk. She still drew comfort from it. Life is changing, isn't it? She whispered to the picture, or more so, the man on it. Hell, life has changed. Everything. She sat down, putting the data slate on the surface. Her hands came put, drawing her hair back behind her head in a ponytail, and she took hold of a hair tie to secure it. She then shook off the listing feeling she had had. Antares and Nova itself were about to redeploy to the center of the lines to serve as a mobile repair facility and breadbasket for the ever-expanding fleets, now that this diplomatic affair was over. Aside from the recent development of the Vral engaging in suicidal ramming attacks against her ships, nothing had changed. The mountain of reports and exchanges on her data slate reflected the Terran Front's strategy of rapid advance perfectly. A list of systems taken and lane nodes secured only continued to grow, and behind them she saw the logistics wing of the fleet, working full force to shore up supply lines. Why does this feel so easy now? She whispered to herself, a statement, not a question, and she let her own statement sink in for a moment. As she looked to her data slate sitting on the desk, she let the feeling take root. Ever since the Battle of the Sands, the Vral had done very little but provide a token resistance, a few ships per system, a single fleet engagement of around 50 ships. As her eyes danced over the multi-connected lanes, she simply stared at them. The chime from her data slate snapped her back into reality, and she actually started. She kept staring at the screen, but tapped the icon to open a direct feed. Fleet Marshal, I'm sorry to disturb you, but the Tyrannica is here to see you. A voice said from beyond her doors, one of the bridge guards she couldn't remember the name of. Send him in, she replied, and the acknowledgement came a moment later. She rose from her desk, then around her desk. She was only waiting a few moments until the door to her private quarters opened. As the light fell on the former ambassador to the Tyrannica conclave, she felt a mix of emotions, a waning hatred, a newfound respect. His body was draped in a heavy heating robe, the scant regrowth of his plumage not nearly enough to keep his body insulated. It was hard to read the Tyrannica at the best of times, and for a moment she wished she had Hazard with her. He strode on his thin legs toward her, then lowered himself in his typical bow to her. It had been a while since she had spoken with him. In fact, the last time she had spoken with him had been directly after he had destroyed his own plumage in protest of his government's stance on the slaves they had bought from the Vral. She aimed to the awkward realization she didn't know quite what to call him. He rose from his stately bow. Fleet Marshal Simmons, he trilled, his translated voice soothing and calm. I hope your plans are progressing well. They are, she said, her arms crossed but relaxed across her chest. The silence descended between the two, and suddenly Simmons canted her head to the side. You'll have to excuse me, I'm not sure what your title is, and… Tikka, the former ambassador said, interrupting her and slowly nodding his head. She gave a half-smile. I will now and forever be just Tikka with you, Fleet Marshal. The bird-like Tyrannica turned his head and fixed his eye on her and closed it slowly before reopening it. The context of that was lost on Simmons, but she nodded all the same. What can I do for you in that case, Tikka? She asked, not moving from her position. Tikka remained where he stood near the door, quiet for a few moments. The silence hung between them, and as Tikka raised his head, Simmons reminded herself who this was. Having sympathy for him, feeling compassion for him, was something that Simmons had not thought she'd ever feel. She still wanted to hate him, but after what he had done, the road he had deliberately put his people on, she couldn't. I received a message today that I thought was a wise matter to bring to you directly. A freighter convoy from the Chikanamori has entered the outskirts of our space-flying diplomatic identification tags. They are calling themselves the Willis Convoy, no doubt in honor of your esteemed ambassador. Tikka had left out the last part, about how the man had been attacked and nearly sacrificed to whatever dark gods the Vral prayed to, and Simmons appreciated it. The Tyrannica continued after a few moments. They will be escorted as is proper to the border and taken through secure conclave space. We do not wish to risk the convoy being caught in the middle of our troubles. Very well, Simmons replied. And even though she wanted to ask about the conflict raging inside of the Tyrannica's home space, she kept her tongue. She didn't need to be able to read Tikka like Hazard could to know that the former ambassador was in torment. His own actions and words had kicked off a conflict that had started with the enslavement of other species and had escalated almost overnight, hundreds of social and civil issues compounding one atop the other. The last time Simmons had looked, there were no fewer than 5 major factions. Millions had died already, and the only thing keeping the entire civilization from descending into full-blown anarchy was the ruling body. The military of the Tyrannica was largely loyal to the traditionalist faction, but even with that mammoth advantage at their disposal, the traditionalists had not employed it. Simmons had no idea why, and to be honest, it perplexed her. She had tried reading the reports of what outside observers from the Terran front were saying, but she couldn't make heads or tails of it. "Is something troubling you, Fleet Marshal?" Tikka's words broke the silence and the spell that had seemed to fall between them both. She shook her head once. "Always more to do in a situation like this," she said, a neutral reply if anything. "Although it is good to see you back on your feet." Tikka's eyes seemed to lit up with a bit of amusement. "Indeed, the ceiling in the medical bay is interesting to stare at, but I've kept myself as busy as I can. For instance, one of your medical crewmen has introduced me to a very interesting genre of entertainment that I've never seen before. Have you ever seen a spy movie?" The Tyrannica shifted on his feet, and a data slate fell out of his robe to land between his feet, and even Simmons began to move forward. She stopped. The glint of amusement in the Tyrannica's eyes seemed to flare. "I find them fascinating." Simmons raised a brow at Tikka. "What about them?" she asked, trying not to look down at the data slate. "Oh, they are wondrous," Tikka said, his voice trilling slightly. "Men and women who operate in the shadows. It's all very interesting. I watched one the other day, made almost 300 cycles ago. Some man from a nation-state called the Brazil needed to pass on some information, and there were chases and gunfights and romance. You'll excuse me if I say so, but I hope your people begin again with your creative side. I believe it is one of your best qualities," Tikka said, positively thrumming. "I am very much enjoying your cinema. I believe that's what it's called." "You don't have that in your own culture?" Simmons asked, still trying not to look at the data slate. "Oh, not at all. We have dance, but no theater like you humans do." Tikka said, "Speaking of which, now that I have delivered my message, I must go. Your crewman has found another bit of cinema that I will be partaking in from before your species made your first interstellar jump to Alpha Centauri. I'm sure it will be fascinating." The Tyrannica entered his low bow once more, then slowly straightened. "Ah, yes. And if you so happen to have a data slate turned in, one that belongs to me, would you be so kind as to return it at your earliest convenience?" Tikka stepped towards the door. "Is there anything on the data slate that you might not want us to know about?" Simmons asked, feeling the corner of her mouth turning upwards. Tikka stopped at the door, the data slate between them on the floor. "No, but there may be a bit of cinema or two on there," Tikka said, the amusement still ringing in his voice, and without waiting for her to answer, he turned for the door. "Anything else? Well, I'm not sure how it got on there to begin with." The door opened, and the long, thin-legged Tyrannica stepped through. As the door closed, Simmons walked forward and picked up the data slate. She stared at the door for a moment longer before looking down at the blank screen. She thumbed the activation icon and her eyes widened. Markers and telemetry data had been translated down into a file that was playing out on the screen, showing hourly updates. It didn't take her too long to see the region she was looking at. The border of the Tyrannica conclave was barely displayed as a line on the topmost portion of the screen, and she saw the hourly readouts constantly updating. Suddenly she saw a new listing of readouts as the file continued, her fleet steadily pushing back the Vral front. She kept watching, seeing the telemetry of her fleet jumping from system to system, small battle after small battle, following the hyperspace lanes, spreading out. The Tyrannica had been monitoring the entire advance, and it appeared they could do so reliably. from almost 20 light-years distance. How they were doing this, how they were even capable, she didn't know. She glanced at the door to where the Turanika had just been, then glanced back down. Her eyes widened, even as the playback of the telemetry on screen slowed down from hourly updates a second to 1 hourly update every few seconds, slowing down even more as the time on the telemetry grew within 24 hours of the current time. The fact that the Vral had been pulling ships from every front was something that was not lost on her. The knowledge that the Vral could produce an absurd amount of ships in a limited time was also something she wasn't blind to. She stalked to the door, hammering the icon to open it, not taking her eyes away. She watched the mass growing, the tendrils of her fleet reaching. She stalked down the short hallway to the bridge and began tapping the icon again. As the door to the bridge slid open, she caught a glimpse of Tikka standing by the door and glanced at him. Her eyes were wide, furious. She came to a full stop. Tikka turned to her and bowed in his stately manner, then quickly came back to full height, then turned and left the bridge. She stared at the doorway he had left for a long moment, then turned and began stalking towards the command dais. A smattering of commanders and captains standing near the table parted for her as she placed the data slate on the table and took hold of her headset. She rapidly entered a command override code, taking control of an entire wing of the communication node designated for command and control. With her last keystroke, she was patched into communications, logistics, fleet tactical, army, intelligence, cryptography, and command and control liaisons for every fleet. Instantly, her ears were flooded with a dozen conversations. "Silence on the net, this is the Fleet Marshal." She barked out, and the conversations of the department ceased. "Admiral Ptolemy, report to the bridge immediately. All fleets are to cease offensive deployment and immediately redeploy to their most recent fallback locations. Any vessel able to operate at 75% effectiveness currently heading for repair stations is to rendezvous with their detachment." All across the bridge, she saw people standing and looking in her direction, only to almost instantly begin calling out orders. The captains and commanders who had been preparing a briefing at the command table before she had arrived overheard her and scattered as if to the winds, heading for their areas of responsibility. "Top priority is the immediate turnaround of all fleets engaged in offensive operations. You have your orders." She took her headset off and threw it down on the table. "Shit!" she exclaimed, then looked down at the data slate again at the size of the return. For a moment she let the scenario play out in her head. She had planned to advance until they met resistance, then compress around that resistance. She had planned on the Vral attempting to spread out to combat them in a front line. Not this. She reached down and pressed her finger on the data slate, pausing the playback. She now saw what the Vral had intended, to cut off the entirety of First and Second Fleet, and drown them in numbers the likes of which made the Battle of the Sands look like a skirmish. At the Battle of the Sands, the fleet had faced the might of the Vral's Terran-facing front, and been outnumbered 3, almost 4 to 1. She stared at the data slate and wondered if she could charitably say she was outnumbered 20 to 1. She felt a pang of fear, seeing exactly how close they had come to absolute disaster, in her mind's eye seeing Second Fleet coming into contact with the Vral, who would have instantly spearheaded down the lane, swallowing the Terran front's northernmost fleets in a tide of ships. She could see her own response, the immediate pullback, only for the Vral to simply plow onwards. The Vral wouldn't stop and engage her. They would simply leave her behind, force her to chase them. She saw it all as if it had already happened. Thermopylae, the last bastion of defense, wouldn't be able to catch and hold this fleet bottled up, not without her on fleet there to provide a screen. The bulk of the Vral fleet would have streamed around Thermopylae like water flowing over a rock. They would have kept going, all the way to Earth. By the time she would have been able to marshal the fleet and even attempt an engagement, Earth would have been surrounded for days, if not weeks. There would have been nothing for her to save but ashes and ghosts. "Shit," she whispered, and then looked back to the door that the former Tyrrhenican ambassador had left through. She decided then and there that she no longer hated Tikka.